Hello and welcome to day 3 of the Zero to Interview Hero Docker course, where I am covering every Docker chapter Q&A you need to know to confidently crack your interviews. With this course, you'll never skip a question in your Docker interview. Today, in day 3, we will cover chapter 3, which is one of the core concepts, that is Docker container. So let's get started and make sure you're fully prepared for your interview.
Starting with our first question, a container keeps crashing on start. How do you approach this? Here's how you can respond. First thing I do is run Docker logs with the container ID. Usually it tells me what went wrong. In most cases, it's either a bad config, a missing environment variable, or the main process exiting due to an application error. If logs don't help, I run container in interactive mode with docker run-it and manually debug it from there. Moving on with our next question. You hit a port already in use error while running a container. How do you fix this? Here's how you can respond. That means the host port I am trying to bind is already taken. So I either stop whatever's using it or change the host port using -p 8081:80 instead of -p 8080:80. This is a quick fix, but I always double check if the new port breaks any dependent services. Moving on with our next question. What do you do if the host runs out of disk due to Docker? Here's how you can respond. This happens when old images, stopped containers, and unused volumes pile up. I run docker system prune-a, but only after making sure nothing important goes wiped. On CI/CD machine, I usually set up automated cleanup via cron or system timers. Moving on with our next question. How do you make sure container data isn't lost after restart? Here's how you can answer. To ensure container data isn't lost after a restart, I always use Docker volumes or bind mounts for persistent storage. Specifically, I create named volumes using Docker volume create or mount host directories using the -v flag during Docker run. For example, in a database container like MySQL, I map a volume to var lib MySQL. This way, even if the container stops, restarts, or gets deleted, the actual data persists independently because it's stored outside the container's writable layer.
Additionally, for production system, I regularly prefer to back up some volumes and where needed use volume drivers that support remote storage or snapshots for added reliability.
Moving on with our next question. A container won't start and gives no useful logs. What's next? Here's how you can respond. If the logs are empty, I assume the container is failing super early. I rerun the image with an interactive shell with docker run-itsh and try starting the app manually. This helps isolate issues like missing dependencies or startup scripts failing silently. Starting with our next question. How do you reduce Docker image size in your projects? Here's how you can answer. To reduce Docker image size, I follow a multi-step approach. First, I always use minimal base images like Alpine wherever possible. Second, I optimize Docker files by minimizing the number of layers, combining related commands with the double and cleaning up unnecessary files like caches within the same layer. I also use multi-stage builds to separate build time dependencies from final runtime image, so only the essential are shipped. Additionally, I regularly scan for and remove unused packages, assets, and dependencies. Keeping images small improves security, speed ups deployment, and saves storage and network bandwidth. Moving on with our next question. Your containers can't talk to each other. What do you do next? Here's how you can answer. First, I check if they are on the same user defined bridge network. If not, I attach them using Docker Network Connect. Then, I try pinging or curling between them using their container names, which works as host names in that network. Moving on with our next question. How do you roll back a failed container deployment? Here's how you can answer. I always tag the previous stable version image before deploying a new one. If the new one fails, I just redeploy the older tag. In orchestration systems like Docker Swarms or Kubernetes, I would roll back the service version directly. Moving on with our next question. A container exit with code 137. What does that mean? Here's how you can respond. That's an out of memory error. It means the container got killed by the kernel. I would increase the memory limit with hyphen hyphen memory, or if I am in dev, I try optimizing the application or breaking into smaller services. Moving on with our next question. How do you deal with the logs in production containers? Here's how you can respond. I avoid storing logs inside containers. I use JSON-file logging driver during dev, but in production I send logs to a centralized system like ELK or Fluentd via log driver. Makes troubleshooting much easier later. Moving on with our next question. Why might a change in Dockerfile not reflect in the image? Here's how you can respond. Docker builds use cache heavily. So if a line earlier in the Docker file hasn't changed, later steps are cached too. I rebuild with hyphen hyphen no hyphen cache or introduce a dummy arg to invalidate the cached when needed. Moving on with our next question. What's your process for debugging networking issues between containers? Here's how you can respond. First, I confirm the network with Docker network ls or inspect. Then I execute into one container or ping or curl the other. If DNS fails, I check the container name and try IPs. Also verify firewall rules or exposed ports. Moving on to our next question. You get ImagePullBackOff on a Kubernetes pod. What's your first check? Here's how you can respond. I immediately run kubectl describe pod name to find the root cause. I check if the image name and tag are correct, whether the image is in a private registry and needs a image pull secret, and if the image was pushed properly. Depending on the issue, I would fix the image reference config, the right pull secret, or push the missing image.
Moving on with our next question. What's your strategy to keep Docker host clean? Here's how you can answer. I use Docker system prune almost regularly and also limit the number of image versions retained in a CI. On production, I set up cleanup scripts and avoid storing logs or temporary files inside containers.
Moving on with our next question. How do you keep a container running in the background during debugging? Here's how you can answer. I add tail-f dev null at the end of the Docker file or entry point temporarily. This keeps it alive so I can execute on it and debug the entire environment manually.
Moving on with our next question. What's the difference between bind mounts and volumes? Here's how you can respond. Bind mounts are great for development. When I want live sync with local files, volumes are better for data persistence and portability in production. Docker manages them so they are less error prone. Moving on with our next question. What's the first thing you would check if Docker says cannot connect to daemon? Here's how you can answer. Either Docker isn't running, so I would run systemctl start docker, or I don't have the right permissions. So I would check if my user is in the Docker group or just prefix of sudo.
Moving on with our next question. How do you monitor the health of container? Here's how you can respond. I add a health check in the Docker file that pings a service endpoint. Docker tracks the status and I can see it via Docker PS or inspect. It helps auto restart unhealthy containers in orchestration. Moving on with our next question. You are in a team. How do you ensure Docker images are consistent across all devs? Here's how you can respond. We use versioned Docker files and keep them in Git. Everyone builds using the same tags, and we store base images in a shared registry. For local dev, we might use Docker Compose to ensure everyone runs the same setup.
Moving on with our next question. How do you run a container in interactive and detached mode? When would you use each? Here's how you can respond. I use the -it flags for interactive mode, mainly when I want to work inside the container like debugging or manual testing. For detached mode, I use a -d docker run -d image to run containers in the background. Useful for services like web servers or databases. Choosing between them depends on whether I need a live session or a background service.
Moving on with our next question. How do you execute a command inside a running container without restarting it? Here's how you can respond. I would use docker execute -it container id command to run commands directly inside a live container without interrupting it. For example, docker exec-it my app bash lets me troubleshoot or inspect the container's internal state in real time without downtime. Moving on with our next question. What is the difference between docker execute and docker attach? Here's how you can respond. Docker execute starts a new process inside a running container, isolated from the main process so it's safe and won't impact the container's lifecycle. Docker attach connects me directly to the container's main process. It's riskier because if I close the session improperly, it could stop the container. So I prefer exec for troubleshooting to avoid accidental shutdowns.
That is it for today. See you in the next one.